The concept of like dissolves like means that substances with similar intermolecular forces are likely to be soluble in one another. For example, polar substances are attracted to the positives and negatives, so polar substances are soluble in other polar substances. Non-polar substances would not want to mix with polar substances. They would prefer to be soluble in nonpolar substances. So let's break this down further. Nonpolar molecules are soluble in nonpolar solvents. For example, carbon tetrachloride is soluble in benzene, and here's the Lewis structure. So carbon tetrachloride is a tetrahedral molecule that is nonpolar, and benzene is made up of all carbon and hydrogen, and it is also nonpolar, so those dissolve very well in one another. Benzene is a common nonpolar solvent. Polar molecules are soluble in polar solvents. So ethanol has hydrogen bonding, it's polar, and it's soluble in water, which also has hydrogen bonding and polar. So you can see that the ethanol has an OH group that makes it polar, and water is one of the most polar substances, so it works well to dissolve polar compounds. Ionic compounds don't really have intermolecular forces, but they do have positive and negative charges, and they are more soluble in polar solvents and would not dissolve well in nonpolar solvents. So for example, salt, table salt, would dissolve well in water, which you know, but ammonia is also a polar liquid, and it will make a good solution. So salt should dissolve in ammonia. However, if you try to mix some of these things, the carbon tetrachloride, which is nonpolar, it will not dissolve in water, which is polar. They will not mix very well. All right, so some examples of this would be water-soluble vitamins. Vitamin C, you can see, has lots of oxygen in it, so that helps make the substance polar. It also has a little bit of hydrogen bonding. So it's water-soluble, and that's why your system can absorb lots of, or you can take in lots of vitamin C. It easily dissolves in your system, but it's also excreted out very easily. Whereas fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin E, you see it has much less oxygen in it, so it's not as polar. And this entire chain down here is made up of all carbons at each one of these points. And so it's very nonpolar. So it dissolves in nonpolar things like fat, and therefore our body stores it, and you would have to be careful about how much you take in.